if you're listening right now, you're in luck, because joining us now, Congressman, 1st District, Republican, Virginia, Rob Wittman, chairman of the all-powerful Sea Power Subcommittee. Chairman Wittman, good to have you.
John, it's great to be with you this morning. I know you've got lots of things going on, so thanks for having me on.
Oh, we're having too much fun for one man to have, but we're glad you joined us. What a week, Congressman. What a week. Never a dull moment in Trump world. So I don't know where to start. Let's start with Trump's deal with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. I know you don't spend a lot of time hanging out with them. Does a 90-day deal, keeps the government open, and basically thumbs his nose at Paul Ryan and says he's had enough. And the debt then immediately goes up to $20.3 trillion with no end in sight. And we were supposed to get tax reform in that 90 days. Now, yesterday, the debate shifts to DACA, amnesty, no wall. What on earth, pray tell, sir, is going on?
Well, John, it is it's an interesting time there, as you know, with our efforts to try to responsibly deal with the debt, and that is, if you're going to increase the debt ceiling, I think there needs to be some other fiscal reforms that go along with it. I think the president, though, looks at this and says, listen, I want to get things done. I think that frustration came through. He said, let's clear the deck for the next 3 months to allow tax reform to get done. That's another critical element of what has to get done. I want our leadership to come out with a plan. It's this constant, wait. The American people want to know what's in the plan. We want to know what's in the plan. When they're asking us to vote for this upcoming budget resolution, which I want to reflect a reduction in spending to make sure that we're on top of managing this nation's financial resources in relation to our deficit and debt. I want some definition about what's going to be in that tax reform package. And with that not being there, that I think creates a lot of frustration. So I think the president's pushing forward that, saying, hey, listen, if there's not going to be any definition, or if the leadership, this big six in the House and Senate, aren't going to come out with things, I'm going to push the issue, which I don't blame him. And that's the businessman in him coming out saying, I want to get these things done. And I'm with him. When I talk about the principles I want to see in tax reform, it's hard for people to put that in context, and they say, well, gosh, Rob, that sounds great. What's going to happen? And I said, well, that's what I'd like to see, but I don't know, because the leadership hasn't come out with this. And think about this, John. We are now getting ready to be at the end of the budget year for fiscal year 17, and we have not adopted a budget for fiscal year 18, which will start on the 1st of October. So I think you see and hear that. I think, too, that obviously with the DACA issue, there's a desire when we talk about these policies involving immigration, it has to include the sovereign nation issue of border security. If we're a sovereign nation, you have to be able to secure your borders. You can't have just this piecemeal effort on what we need to do with immigration without talking about what we're going to do to secure our borders. So I think the president is saying, hey, listen, we're going to talk about this overall. And again, I look at his efforts as being focused on problem solving. Here are the problems there on our plate. Let's get these things taken care of. Let's make sure we lay out those ideas. Let's make sure we get to a point where we can make those things happen. That's what I think the president's doing. I think there are certain principles that we have to put forward with that, the things that we believe in, the things that many of us up there have been talking about, not just for months but for years. Those are things critical for us to get done. So.
All right, so Congressman, let's get to DACA. Trump ended the program. We've already talked about this. And if Congress acts, right, acting means you create legislation, and you've got two issues. The first issue is, what do you do with the 690 to 720,000 people that are in the program now? What is the platform for them? Because if you do nothing, when their 2-year work permits eventually expire, they have three choices. They can leave the country, try to stay in the country legally by finding other alternatives, other visa programs they qualify for, and try to go through the legal process. Or number three, they stay illegally and run that risk. I mean, those are the only options they're going to have. So you have that, right? That's separate. You got that 7 And the real number is not 850, it's 720. That's the real number. 690 now, 33,000 applications in process. If 30 of those thousands get in, of the 33, paperwork is good, it's 720. So that's number one. How do you deal with that, if anything? Because if you do nothing, you go back to the alternative I mentioned. The second issue, which everybody really fears on the Trump side, is that what we're going to get is a bill that not only deals with the 720,000 people in the program now, but extends DACA going forward and takes in new applications, which would be then basically blanket amnesty with no end in sight. How do you see this playing out?
Well, John, I think you lay it out perfectly. The alternatives that are there, and I am one that is adamant that this can't be amnesty going forward. You have to say this is where we're going to set the policy. You're right. We have to deal with the 720,000 individuals that are here. I think as you look across the board, I think there's agreement to say, we don't hold children responsible for the things that their parents have done, but from a point in time, you have to say those folks that are here or have applied at some point in time, from their back, we take up those issues of the folks that are here. But going forward, you have to say, here are the set of requirements that you have to follow. That is, parents have to come here legally, and they have to make sure when they do that, and if children come with them, that their children are also pursuing either their status in this country legally or their pursuit of citizenship legally. I mean, that's sort of the principles of law that we've always applied, that we have to apply going forward. So I see it in two buckets. What do we do to deal with the folks that are here? And at some point in time, probably about the time that a piece of legislation would come forward, from that point back, deal with everyone that's here. But from that point forward, here are the set of requirements that parents and children have to meet in order to come into the country. And if you don't do the things necessary to be considered under the status of being here, then you are going to be faced with the requirements of what you put in place for going forward. And that is parents meeting the law, children meeting the law. I mean, this is, to me, pretty simple and straightforward. It's a matter of how do you get that into a piece of legislation, and how do, as you say, not create a situation where it's just a free-for-all with people coming in not being held to the standards in the law that are there today. I mean, those, as I said, those things are pretty simple and straightforward.
So are you in favor of some sort of an amnesty program for the 720,000 people that are registered in the DACA program now, Congressman?
No, I wouldn't call it amnesty, John. What I would say is that those individuals that are here, you would have to look at what are they? What is their status as they're here? In other words, are they? There are a lot of these kids are students. They're doing a great job here. Some not so much. Some with criminal issues, those kinds of things. So I think you have to set up a set of standards and said, listen, if you meet these standards, if you are working hard, if you're doing all the things that we know most of these kids are doing, then here's what you can do to pursue legal status. But if not, if you are sideways with the law and those kinds of things, then there is a different standard there. So I don't think that you can have a blanket policy and say, hey, everybody that's here beforehand can get to stay. I think you have to say, here are the conditions that you have to meet. And as I said, most of these kids meet that standard. But, we don't want to say, hey, somebody that's sideways with the law gets to be treated the same way as a student that's working hard, been successful in school, is out there doing good things. You can't treat both of those the same. So I think you have to have a debate about what are the standards for folks to be able to pursue that legal status here in this country.
That makes sense. I mean, look, I could live with a legislative action on the 720,000 people that are here now that is a rigorous process, for them to get to some sort of permanent legal status. I think citizenship, they have to apply through the normal channels. But Trump has already said, even if there's no legislation, he's instructed ICE not to change their priorities, which means they're not going to be rounded up anyway. They're just going to be here illegally. So nobody's going to round them up and kick them out. That is not going to happen. So there probably should be some method. But in order to get that, I want, a concession. Here's what bothers a lot of people. Now we're going to turn to North Korea. Is establishment Republicans in Washington don't want a wall. And the reason they don't want a wall is because a wall, you can't get rid of it if there's a regime change. That's the problem. See, because whatever these massive programs are that Trump is talking about, you can get a new president in who could do what Obama did. Look the other way, not enforce them, not hire the border agents, tell ICE to do something else. But when you have a wall, you're not going to tear it down. So that's why this is so, in so many people's mind, this is so critical, especially Congressman, because Trump campaigned on this thing for 20 months. You just can't say, well, I changed my mind. We can rebuild the fence or put some barbed wire on it. That's not what he said. I don't think that's going to fly.
No, I agree, John. I think people look at it and say, we want our border to be secured. A major part of that is a wall, barrier, whatever you want to call it. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, I think, has done a really good job in looking at a lot of different alternatives. How can they create that barrier that is effective? And they've tried, have gone through kind of the evaluation of a number of different ways to do that. We've looked at that information they've sent back to us. I think they're doing it the right way. And I think if you talk to the American people, to me, as I hear from them, it makes sense to them. They said, yeah, we're a sovereign country. We do have to protect our borders. We do have to do that in ways that are most effective. And what they're looking at with the wall, the barrier, whatever you want to call it, is how do we effectively maintain security for this nation? And let me tell you, that's one of those constitutional requirements that we as a Congress have, that the president has, and that the nation expects of us, securing this nation, and that is there on the border and making sure that we have that physical barrier on the border. I think, to me, that's, a simple and, again, another simple and straightforward expectation from the American people.
Simple and straightforward. Okay, let's get to North Korea yesterday launching another ICBM test over Japan. And if you were in certain parts of Japan yesterday, you woke up to sirens as this thing passed over. Now, our military determined that it posed no threat, so they didn't shoot it down. But this is another belligerent act. They did the same thing a week ago. They said it was a hydrogen bomb. I mean, at what point do we say, this is not good, we've had enough?
Well, John, as you know, Kim Jong-un continues to accelerate these actions. Now, it's not the firing of the missile itself; it's the testing that goes into them being able to develop a weapon that could effectively reach the United States. That's what concerns me. They're doing this at a breakneck pace, which means they're doing everything they can to learn about what works and what doesn't, so that they can deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States. I think we have to do even more. I want to give Ambassador Nikki Haley credit. As you know, there was an additional sanctioning effort that came out of the UN, and one place where I think it can be very effective, and that is reducing oil imports into North Korea. Essentially, China imports the oil into North Korea, and essentially, if you were to fully cut off oil imports, you could bring North Korea to its knees. Now, I think China is concerned that if they fully embargoed oil going in, that you'd have a regime collapse, and then they would worry about the instability of what would happen in the border area and how that would affect China. But they've at least been willing to reduce oil imports there to have an impact on the regime. I think Kim Jong-un is focused on getting a nuclear capability. I don't think he's going to talk to anybody or do anything until he gets to the point where he feels he is a viable nuclear power, and that is where I believe he wants to be, so that he has a negotiating advantage with the rest of the world. And so I think we just have to come to that realization, figure out, what can you do diplomatically in the meantime, and we are going to quickly reach a point to decide, where and what are we willing to do to keep him from getting this intercontinental ballistic missile capability to deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States. And I just don't think that we can be at that point, because I think the chaos and the problems it creates for the United States then are equally as problematic. Now, it's a very, very tough decision, because now, if you were to pursue things from a military standpoint, I think we all know the outcome of that, first of all, is unpredictable, and all the scenarios that you add up there all come with significant impacts on places like South Korea and even potentially Japan in that region, and they are monumental in scope and what the impact would be. So there are not a lot of easy choices out there. We did have a briefing last week with Director Coates, with Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, and Chairman Dunford, and they laid out pretty clearly the things that they are doing, what they see happening with Kim Jong-un. And none of those scenarios are ones where you go, oh, hey, there's a clear solution, we can do this, or even being able to really predict what the reaction in the long run by Kim Jong-un is going to be. So it's one of those really thorny issues. We look at it on a daily basis, but it on a daily basis, it continues to get more and more problematic, and his behavior gets more and more aggressive, which endangers the rest of the world.
Very quickly, Susan Rice, 2 days ago, admits she unmasked people that were in Trump world before she left office. She first said she didn't. Now she said she didn't unmask them. She gave reasons why. I mean, if this was a Republican administration and this had happened, there would be calls for imprisonment for this woman. Why the silence on that left?
Well, it's as you said. There's a different standard. Unfortunately, it's being applied here. We in the United States hold very dear how the government deals with private citizens and their individual liberties and freedoms, and this, I think, is an affront to that. I think the Congress needs to hold Susan Rice accountable. I am hopeful that leadership there will pursue this as well as other avenues. I just don't think that you can tolerate this, to have the government unmask individuals for political purposes. I mean, that's a slippery slope, and if you tolerate that or allow that to go unresponded to or without consequence or without accountability, you open up the doors for that to be used as a political tool in the future. And let me tell you, the last thing we need is a government to use a political tool to gather information on individuals and then use that politically, which is exactly what Susan Rice did.
But nothing happens to her. I mean, this is amazing. This is just amazing to me. Nothing happens. There'll be no inquiry. I mean, we got Robert Mueller running around, trying to look up everybody that worked for Trump, and everybody's got to get lawyers, and including people like Hope Hicks and things like that who had nothing to do with anything. And yet we have the director of our national security apparatus unmasking people, and it's a collective legacy media shrug. I mean, this got no play. It's really mind-boggling. I mean, could you imagine if this was done, if General Flynn was still at the NSC and he hadn't had those disclosure issues, and he had done this at the tail end of a Trump administration? Could you imagine what the coverage would be? They would be going crazy 24/7. Yet Susan Rice does it.
There's a difference. Yes.
Unbelievable. You think maybe things are getting better. Maybe the media is finally picking up that, they have to cover things equally, and they just refuse to do it. And I think the Susan Rice thing is unbelievable. I mean, it's been 3 days. I haven't had one phone call on it, not a text, not an email, because no one is covering it except, me, now.
Well, I agree, John, and Congress needs to act. I mean, I know that Chairman Gowdy on Government Oversight and Reform is looking at it, and Congress has to, I think, look into this and say, what happened, what led to this, where were decisions made, how are we going to hold agencies accountable when we see these types of actions happening, which by any measure are unacceptable. And as you said, I guarantee you, if it occurred if it occurred within a Republican administration, I can guarantee you that there, as you said, that there'd be a very, very different response to it than what we've seen right now with Susan Rice.
Well, you got that right. We're out of time. I want to thank Congressman and Subcommittee Chairman Rob Wittman for being with us.